For 30 miles, the Baker River runs southwest from the North Cascades until it meets the Skagit River, the second largest tributary in Washington state and the largest to feed the Puget Sound. Nestled between mountain slopes, the Baker River is fed by dozens of creeks that channel 120 inches of yearly rainfall and the glacial melt from Mount Baker and Mount Shuksan. The area's heavily wooded terrain, mild temperatures, and abundant rainfall create the perfect habitat for all 5 species of the Pacific salmon: sockeye, coho, Chinook, pink, and chum. Over the millennia, the river has provided the area's first inhabitants with sustenance and transportation. Commercial interests have mined its abundant treasures, while its strong flow has been harnessed to generate power. Through it all, the Baker River continues to flow, providing a wellspring of life for the region. Archaeological discoveries have dated the presence of the earliest people to live along the Baker River some 8,500 years ago.
People were very smart about locating where the resources were. And the most abundant and the most required food to put away for us was the salmon.
The salmon was the single most important food for the Upper Skagit tribe, who inhabited the area around the mouth of the Baker River, as well as the Sauk-Suiattle and Swinomish tribes, whose villages were downstream on the Skagit River and its tributaries. The sockeye salmon, in particular, were not only a dietary staple for tribal members, but also an inspiring element of their culture.
You must honor those things that give their lives so that you may live.
And part of that was we did first salmon ceremonies. We would return the salmon bones back to the river and give our thanks to them for providing for our tribal members.
American Indians built fish weirs on the Skagit and Baker Rivers to direct and slow the progress of migrating salmon. Spears made from bone and dip nets crafted from roots and bark were used to capture salmon. Upper Skagit Indians built intricate pole structures in the spring that stretched across the tributaries to catch the migrating sockeye in the late summer and fall.
Fish would swim up into the trap, and we'd go through and pick out the bright fish, and then we allow the ones that are ready to spawn to continue on to swim up the river.
While the men were primarily responsible for the fishing, the women would prepare the fish to eat or dry the meat and eggs to preserve for the winter months.
The upper part of the Baker would cut them up real thin and then sun-cure on the rocks. If we caught them close to the tribe, it was clean, smoked, and so forth.
Most of your time was spent gathering, drying, and preparing because you understood it wasn't until the next July you would see sockeye again.
One of the tenets was that, the fish don't belong to us. They belong to our relatives upriver and downriver.
Remember, thousands of years, things returned in sufficient numbers for them to harvest. There wasn't any thought that it was going to be gone.
While this cycle continued for generations, the land that the tribes inhabited was considered part of the newly declared Washington Territory in 1853. For Euro-Americans, it was not the silver salmon, but rather the precious metals that first lured settlers to the area in the mid-19th century. As more white settlers arrived in the Washington Territory, violent clashes with local tribes over territory became more common.
Governor Stevens was charged with the task of going out and negotiating treaties with most of the Western Washington tribes.
The United States government put forth the Treaty of Point Elliott that was agreed to and signed by dozens of tribal leaders of the Puget Sound region.
The Point Elliott Treaty was a way to bring peace to many parties.
As part of the treaty, American Indians ceded their right to the land upon which they built their villages. In exchange, the treaty established reservations, provided schools, medical services, farming equipment, and financial compensation. But most importantly, the treaty reserved the right of American Indians to continue fishing on their ancestral lands. Uninhibited, prospectors explored deeper into the territory, arriving at the confluence of the Baker and Skagit River.
One of the prospectors that was looking for precious metals didn't find them. He did, however, find the extensive areas of limestone and clay deposits that were needed to make cement. This was an ideal place, not just for one plant, but it ended up being two plants.
Dense forests gave rise to dozens of sawmills along the waterways, bringing with them roads, rail lines, and other infrastructure.
After there was some kind of viable business going on up here in industry, that drew a lot more people, because then there was a place to work.
By the turn of the 20th century, the influx of white settlers gave birth to the communities of Baker and Cement City on opposite sides of the Baker River. In 1909, the two communities merged and incorporated as the town of Concrete. The Baker River was also the source of another burgeoning industry.
The late 19th century is this incredible heyday of salmon fishing.
Salmon were considered, like a lot of resources, say, like timber, and thought to be inexhaustible.
Purse seines, as big as 2/3 of a mile long and 60 feet deep, would trap anywhere from 6,000 to 10,000 salmon in a single haul.
They developed some mass canning techniques in the late 19th century and early 20th century just to handle the sheer volume.
Canneries that dotted the Puget Sound as early as 1877 reached their peak in 1913, producing some 2.5 million cases of canned salmon annually.
The prevailing mentality was that resources were to be exploited and profit was there.
You still had the idea that you could open fisheries without any concern about what was returning to the river for spawning.
Fisheries experts voiced their concerns as early as the late 1800s, claiming that salmon stocks in the Pacific Northwest were being threatened with annihilation.
This is evident to the Department of Fisheries and the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries that the techniques and the numbers are just going to decimate the runs.
In 1890, a newly appointed state fish commissioner introduced regulations that prohibited purse seines and traps within 3 miles of the Skagit River, as well as creating limited seasons in which various species could be fished. To boost fish propagation, primarily that of the sockeye salmon, the second hatchery in the state was built on the shores of Baker Lake in 1896.
There was a lot of sense that hatcheries would take care of the problem in some ways, and so the state got more involved.
They felt like it was easier to try and make more salmon than to regulate commercial fishing or other means. It was too hard to fight them, too hard to enforce it.
A federal fish commission appointed by President William McKinley deemed the sockeye salmon the most important species of salmon inhabiting the Puget Sound region, and Baker Lake its best-known hatchery site. By 1924, the Baker Lake facility set an all-time record by capturing nearly 15,000 sockeye and collecting 22 million eggs. Over the decades, the fishing rights retained by American Indians under the Point Elliott Treaty went largely ignored. Tribal members who fished on their ancestral land were often the targets of harassment and law enforcement.
The white men didn't want the Indians to fish in the river no more.
People had to take to being outlaws.
We were chased, shot at, and they put us in jail. Get you again, you're going to get longer. We were stubborn. We said, we have this right, we're going to fish, doggone it.
During an era of civil unrest in the 1960s, American Indians raised their voices and demanded acknowledgement of their fishing rights.
Our generation changed. We were united. We were all together working for the same thing.
Ultimately, the federal government filed a suit against the state of Washington in 1974, with the final decision upheld by the Supreme Court. Known as the Bolt decision, it reaffirmed the right of most Washington tribes to fish and further established them as co-managers of the salmon, as well as giving tribes 50% of the allowed fish harvest.
We don't have to hide no more. we still fish to survive.
For thousands of years, the Baker River has served man as a source of sustenance, commerce, transportation, and energy. With so many interests at stake, finding a means for all to coexist has proven to be a daunting challenge. But over time, even the hardest edges are softened by the constant flow of water. Life on the Baker River has changed dramatically over the century, but with that change, a greater understanding of the river's limits has emerged, along with a shared sense of how important the Baker River is to the people of the Northwest.